speak to us.
Good evening, everyone, and before I begin, I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So, I stand before you as an academic, not as a politician, and that's why I've got slides. That's my excuse. The second reason is that when we do this sort of work that I've been asked to talk to you about, which is about women's workforce attachment to the labour market, much of the message can be really clearly shown through some graphs. So that's what I want to show you tonight. Not too many. I've been directed to speak for 15 minutes or maybe 10. Keep it
15's fine.
15, you sure? You can tell me. I mean, I don't think I will possibly go over that, but let's see how we go. You can wind me up when it's getting close, because it is a really interesting area of research and of discussion, and it really is, I think, one of the issues of our time. And when I speak to my students at Sydney University, my undergraduates and the postgraduate students, when we talk about women and work, this is something they really identify with, and I'll show you why in a moment. And much of it is related to what we do in the university sector and in schools, because women have invested a lot in their human capital in education, and this is flowing through to their attachment to the labour force. But of course there are very particular issues that happen in a woman's life, and the main one is having a baby, and we see that that is called a critical change in a woman's labour market status. But much of the research we've done lately, that it's not the first child but the second child that really shifts a woman's ability to participate in the labour market. The second big issue, of course, moving from the personal or the individual to the economy-wide issue, it's the one of, do we need more women in the labour market to increase Australia's productivity? And that is an issue about growing the labour market, which comes back to many of the policy issues that political parties on both sides have been discussing lately. So why is this such an issue? I'm going to have to move around a little bit. I want to thank one of my colleagues who often works with me, and she is a member of your electorate and is also in the audience. So thank you very much, Alex Heron. Alex and I have done a lot of work over the years on women's participation in the labour market. So what we're drawing on here is data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. It's the most recent data we can use, and it's very reliable. The first graph that you can see there is something that you probably experience or know about in your lives in some way, and that is women's and men's, or male and female, participation rates since 1978. And there are two clear trends. The first is men's participation rate has been slowly declining, levelling out, and women's participation rate has been on a constant increase. Now, when we talk about participation rates, we're talking about those people who are offering themselves to the labour market for work. They may not be in work, but they are making themselves available for work. And participation rates are one of the key indicators, if you like, of labour market activity. So in a recession, often participation rates drop because people internalise the labour market sort of opportunities and withdraw from the labour market. But over the sort of many years and decades we've got presented there, we can see, as I said, two clear trends: men's participation rates slowly declining, women's constantly increasing. The second graph here is employment rates. So these are numbers of people employed in the labour market. And this is the second key shift in Australia's labour market. And that is that men's employment continues, for the most part, to be in full-time jobs, so that's the top blue line. Women's employment is split, almost 50-50. It's sort of 53%, 47% between full-time work and part-time work. Another interesting trend is the growing proportion or numbers of men in part-time work. Much of that would be accounted for by men studying, or probably in their early years of from about 19 to 25, combining work and study. But the two middle lines there, the red line and the purple line, show the pattern that really distinguishes Australia from many other countries around the world. The UK has a similar pattern, and the Netherlands. And that is that we have adopted what many people call the 1.5 model, or that is one primary breadwinner in a family and the other person working half-time or part-time. We might call that the 1+ model, and if you're an industrial relations sort of expert or you love the old industrial relations history of Australia, we refer to that as the decline of the harvester man, or that sort of model that our industrial relations system was built on has actually really been strongly eroded. So they're the 2 points to keep in mind so far: increasing female participation rates, but split in terms of employment between full-time and part-time employment. All right, the next graph, and I promise that I'm trying not to focus all the attention on the graphs, but I think they are very illustrative of what is happening, is what we call, or often referred to as the M curve. And this is women's female participation rates since 1978. And we've broken it down into decades for you: 78, 88, 98, 2008 and 2013. Now this is probably one of the most interesting graphs that you can ever see, I think, because it shows a dramatic change, and you can all see that. You only really need to concentrate on the bottom darker blue line and the top lighter blue line. And what that graph shows is that women are continuing to enter the labour market even in their prime childbearing years. And that is a major social shift in Australia, and it is really an indicator of the big changes that are happening in gender relations, both in the workplace and in the home. Because when you've got all those women at work, it's obviously sending different messages about who's doing the caring and work in the home. That, though, as we see later, that hasn't shifted as much as you might expect. And the big thing to notice is that that blue line continues to move up until we get to about 55, and that's the second big shift that we've really started to notice in the last 5 to 7 years, the number of older women who are staying in the labour market. And that, of course, sets up another set of challenges about elder care and which women are going to look after the older people and the grandchildren. So there are sort of tensions emerging now amongst that older age group, as well as the younger women who are looking after the younger children. We used to call that dip the nappy valley, and we can see that that nappy valley is sort of eroding now. Now, the next graph is just by way of contrast to show you what men's workforce participation looks like over their life course. And again, we see some significant changes. Now, this is a classic male pattern. It hasn't changed that much, except that men in their younger years, you'll notice, are not entering the labour force as early as they used to. And recently, they're staying in the labour market for longer. And that would probably be a response to the global financial changes that occurred from about 2008 on. So this is a classic pattern, but overall you can see, and you see that sort of replication from that very first graph I showed you, that there are fewer men in the labour market overall. They're entering later, they're staying a bit longer than they were a decade or two ago. Excuse me. All right, I will stop the graphs soon. So this is just an idea of, excuse me, women's full-time employment rates. Now, I don't want to give you a whole lecture on labour market economics, but employment rates refer to the number of women who are actually in jobs, as opposed to participation rates, which is the number of women who are offering themselves to the labour market. This is full-time employment, and you can see in this graph that we still do have quite a big shift in those childbearing years. So the orange line is where we are in 2013, and you can see that M dip still quite pronounced in terms of full-time employment. And much of that then, what is happening there is that those women who have left the labour market to have a child are not returning to full-time employment, but they are returning to work, because we've seen those previous graphs. They're returning to part-time employment in some combination of hours. The ideal, it would seem, for most women is a preference around 19 to 21 hours, but they could be working between 5 and 34 hours. But there would be a sort of a happier medium around the 20 hours a week if they could get it. Now, many people, of course, and many qualitative studies we've done show that a lot of women, especially in professional jobs, work 3 days a week. They take work home on the 4th day, and they are often on call, at least on their mobiles, on the 5th day and over the weekend, even if they're only being paid for the 3 days or 4 days a week. But their preference often is to have that so it gives some flexibility. So it's this constant balance between maintaining a commitment to your career or profession or the labour market and finding the time to be with the children a couple of days a week and do those other duties. And that seems to be what we've got happening in Australia now, and that's of course where the policy issues really start to take hold. How do we make those events in a woman's life more equitable? Because the combination of stepping out of the labour market, moving out of full-time work, is not just that they decrease their own weekly income, they decrease their lifetime earnings because, one, they're not earning as much, they're not contributing to their superannuation in the same way, but most frequently they're also taking a backward step or a step down in terms of where they sit within an organisation, and it's very hard to capture that once you return to work after 5 years or so out of the labour market. Now, there is a lot of discussion, there's a lot of debate these days about Australia's poor participation rates amongst women, and I think that debate has to be very, very, very carefully, personally, I think this debate has to be very carefully analysed. Australia sits sort of midway in most of our sort of comparable countries, and we have seen an increase in women's participation rates. As I said before, that has been quite marked, especially in the last decade. The issue here is, do we want women to enter the labour market no matter what the quality of jobs that they're entering and no matter what the repercussions for children and family life is? So, I think this issue is really about, yes, we need to encourage workforce attachment and we need to make it fairer than it currently is, but we also need to make it work in a way that assists those women to participate in good quality jobs. And I think that issue is one we really need to think about. Now, I've spoken a lot about the labour market and attachment to the labour market so far. The other debate that goes on in most people's bedrooms or lounge rooms or kitchens is what's being done in the home. Who's sharing the care and the domestic duty at home? And, we've even seen some of this debate enter the public and political discourse more recently, with some of our more recent policies having as an objective an aim to improve gender equity in the home as well as the workplace. But what we see here is that men's hours and minutes spent with children and in childcare hasn't changed that much. Women's has. Women continue to do both work, paid work and unpaid work, and the real squeeze on women's lives is that they have no leisure time or time to themselves. That's really what's gone out of their lives. I think I'm getting the wind up. Oh, sorry.
No, you're not. No,
I'm not? Okay. I just wanted to touch on another big issue, if you want to talk about that tonight too, and that it is related. It's the issue about women in leadership positions. This is taken from the latest census of women in leadership conducted by the Workplace Gender Equality Agency and UTS. And this debate has been going on for some time, and part of the explanation, only part, is because of the debate about women can't commit full-time unless the policies work for them, and if you can't be in the office in these sorts of jobs that demand full-time engagement in order to get promoted to those sort of executive level ranks and then to the senior level ranks and then onto boards, then we're going to see this sort of glass ceiling stay around for quite a long time. So without some very positive or affirmative action style policies, I doubt that we'll see much change in the sort of proportions of women in senior leadership positions. I know that we've had a debate about this in terms of company boards and chairs, and there's been some voluntary action there, but it hasn't really shifted to any great degree, the proportions of women in those positions. And in fact, the indicators are this year that it's stalled. So that issue is also one to keep in mind, and it does relate to those participation, employment rates, and the policies that facilitate women's involvement in the labour market. So if we just do a quick summing up, we see that we have had women increasing their participation. I haven't mentioned the pay gap yet explicitly. We can talk about that later if you like. Women continue to share most of the domestic load. Another area that we can discuss later is the high degree of occupational segregation that exists in Australia, and very difficult to shift. The sticky floor, non-career track jobs are still around, and they tend to be dominated by women. There's very little leadership. There's very little movement in terms of women in leadership positions. So the very last couple of slides I want to talk about now. I'm sorry, I've done this the wrong way, but I'll go to this quickly. It's education and women's human capital. The point I made earlier was that women, as many of you would be aware, are entering educational institutions in greater numbers than they ever have before. The number of women in the university sector is now 55 to 56% of all students. They tend to come out with higher grades. They are, however, sort of corralled into particular degrees or areas of study. In my own business school, for example, it's not uncommon for me to have 24, 25 young women in a human resource management honours class, and for there to be 25 to 27 young men in a finance class. And so that sort of educational segregation is starting very early on, and it feeds directly into the labour market. So women do tend to study in silos. It's part of the explanation, but not the whole explanation, for the occupational segregation that then occurs in the labour market. So to go back to my concluding remarks, and all of these I think are things that we may want to talk about and ask questions about, is that it is a very complex picture now, and it's a moving picture. I think that's another thing to keep in mind. It's not an area of policy or research that stays static, which makes it quite exciting to be in too, and very interesting to be part of. Women's investment in their education is higher than it's ever been before. Women are entering the labour force and staying in it in greater numbers than they ever have before. However, women's experience at work is quite different to men's, and it remains the case that women do experience a number of gaps. We hear a lot about the pay gap. They tend to work different hours. There's an hours gap. There's a progression gap or a career gap. Women don't progress up the corporate ladder in the same way that men do. And there's a segregation gap. Women and men tend to still be in different jobs. However, those changes that we see in the labour market are actually not being reflected at home to the same degree. Now, I say that with a little bit of caution, because I think that there could be, and we don't have enough research to back this up yet, but there could be a bit of a generational shift happening there, where younger men, as they become fathers, take on more of the childcare or the desire to participate. Now, the blockage can be when they enter the corporate world, when they enter organisations, are they given the opportunity to participate and use those policies in the same way that we now expect women to do on the whole? We have seen, I think, over the last 5 years, a number of very significant policy changes. And what's been really interesting is the way in which the debate has even shifted in all political parties about what policies are now needed to address these big changes, both in an economic sense and a social sense. And I expect we might come to some of those. They, of course, are around childcare, parental leave, and workplace flexibility. And they're probably the three big ones at the moment. So I think that if we are to progress as a country that sees itself as a modern, advanced economy, as a fair society, we do need to address these issues of inequitable treatment in the labour market, and the differences between the ways in which men and women both experience work and receive the rewards of work. And I'd be very happy to talk about those issues in more detail when we get to questions. Thank you.